This is Duke University.
Well, I talked about several different kinds of borders. I began, interestingly, with the classroom as a bordered space. And part of what I have been interested in is spatial location in education, where we get outside of the traditional classroom and learn in different kinds of spaces. And the traditional classroom really can itself be a very serious kind of border. Certain people are not allowed in, and within that space, within those borders, those of us who are familiar with classrooms, familiar with education, can be very comfortable, and education can take a certain very limited kind of form. So the first border that we talked about that evening was the border of the classroom itself, and getting out of that border, outside those borders of the classroom walls, can actually be a rather discomforting thing. The professor no longer necessarily has the same kind of comfort and authority. The students are in a different kind of space. So I have been experimenting with a couple of colleagues for many years with the issue of spatial location and learning in different kinds of spaces. In particular, the two spaces that we focused on were the streets of Atlanta, where taught classes among homeless people, and then the prison context, which bring their own sets of borders. Well, as a part of my life and work and ministry, I spent generally for a number of years, not the whole time I was in Atlanta, but for about 6 years, would spend a day to a day and a half with homeless people, a great portion of that just on the streets, in the spaces where they hang out, the places where they eat, visiting at times in the jail, in the hospital with homeless people. And a part of that, when I would teach classes, one of the requirements for each class that we taught, and I generally team taught with a person who had much more experience than I did on the streets of Atlanta. One of the requirements was to spend a 24-hour period on the streets. And during those periods, we didn't take a driver's license, we couldn't have any money, no identification, so there was a real vulnerability there. And one night, as I shared with the class, we actually overstayed our welcome in one of the parks downtown, which was a very contested space. It was shortly before the Olympics, and they came up to us, and rather than asking us to leave after the curfew, which would have normally been the case and which we would have expected, they immediately placed all of us under arrest. And it's a long story. We didn't end up having to go to jail, and while they were dealing with us, the other homeless people in the park got away, so that was a nice thing. But what happened is we ended up getting caught in a sweep that they were doing. We read about it actually in the paper a couple of days later, a sweep that was going on before the Olympics. So that's the kind of experience then that shaped the rest of the class. Obviously, we had not only crossed the border outside the classroom, but we're in a space at a time where very few people like me, very few privileged people, spend time at that time of the night. And we found then that we had also crossed another border and were in the park a bit too late, and ran into all kinds of interesting problems that created a lot of reflection in the days and weeks ahead in the class. The borders at Butner Federal Prison, where I've been teaching a class this semester through Project Turn, and through the Divinity School, which has a fairly extensive program of offering courses consisting of half students from the prison and half students from the Divinity School, who are coming together to take a class as equal students in the class. There you're talking about, as you said, quite physical borders. In fact, you drive up to Butner Federal Prison. It's an enormous complex, and you see the razor wire and the walls, and it is quite imposing and sends a signal about you're supposed to be out and they're supposed to be in. And in order to get in, you have to go through training. You go through a number of steps, and so you cross quite literally a very strong border there that does keep the people who are not in prison and the people who are in prison apart, and keeps us from getting to know each other, keeps us from learning about each other, and often makes the kind of labeling that goes on of people in prison easier to do. If we're not having to come face to face with them, if we're not having to talk with them to get to know them, then it's just much easier to function with labels of felon or convict or criminal that often guide the way we treat them.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.